another episode of Behind the Mic. I am your host, Zainab, a senior political analyst at Roshni, where we dive into thought provoking conversations and explore global events with experts such as our guest today, Professor Salman Rashid. He holds a master's in politics from Government College Lahore and an MPhil in international relations from Punjab University Lahore. With 23 years of experience in teaching A-level history, his expertise span across international organizations like the UN and Cold War history. I'm thrilled to be guiding you to this episode, whether you're a long-time listener or tuning in for the first time. We're excited to have you with us as we explore the growth of the United Nations as a global power. So without any further ado, let's get started, Professor. How are you doing today?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am good. How are you, Zainab? How are you, Shayan? Nice to see you people. It's my pleasure to join you people for this discussion. I hope we'll actually learn from each other while discussing some global politics, especially US and US behavior right now in contemporary times and in the past as well.
So my first question for you, Professor, is in your speculation, how did the expansion of the United Nations in North America shape its overall presence as a global power? And was this due to manifest destiny justification or because of other factors, for example, economic or social?
Zainab, if you look into the US and US legacy, it's very, very important to understand the US geography, first of all. Across North Atlantic, away from the European continental politics in 18th and 19th century, that was something where US was created and US emerged as a country in late 18th century, in 1776, 78 onwards. Since then, Americans mostly persuaded the policy of isolation mainly from the politics of continent because 18th and 19th century Europe witnessed a lot of conflicts within the continental politics and European powers were actually looking for the new international markets as a result of industrialization and they were looking for expansion in in that pursuit they were actually invariably looking for new markets and they were having clashes in the Central Asia, they were having clashes in Southeast Asia, Far Eastern countries, even in the Middle East or in the African continent. Americans at that time decided to keep themselves away and isolated from the politics, and this allowed them to slowly and gradually emerge as an economic entity over a period of time. Another important aspect which made the US distinct from other nations that they always remain a country which is the melting pot of the world. People for different reasons migrate and decide to live in that North American region, in American place, and gradually they start to emerge. 19th century marked a major change in American history because those three earlier states who actually started the actual US further expanded and their territorial gains spread so much that they were now a recognizable global entity. Keeping everything in mind, American geography, American natural resources, American policy of isolation, this allowed them to emerge as a major power or as a global entity by that time, and they were not rather wasting those economic resources in the conflicts in the continent or beyond continental politics in Asia or elsewhere. So, in my personal opinion, their natural geography played a very, very important role in emerging US initially. Their first 100, years allowed them to stand as an economic, political, cultural entity. And gradually, over a period of time, when Europe witnessed those conflict situations in World War One and Two beyond, and even in the Cold War, by that time, Americans emerged as the sole superpower or as one of the major powers of the world, and they are the one who are actually dictating the global politics even in the contemporary times.
Yeah. And what would you say about the manifest destiny justification, the painting, that basically talked about how the Americans were divinely ordained by God to basically expand and take over nations that were in deep depression?
Zainab, as I told you, the natural geography helped them a lot. Other than that, another thing which attracted people across the globe, if you look at the American social cultural composition or richest Americans right now or Fortune 500 companies right now, you will observe one single thing in the US culture and US character that there is hardly anyone who is third or fourth generation American. Either they are first or second generation migrants settled in the US and made their own destinies. So, the rule of law, equality of economic opportunity,
Yeah.
policies which are not discriminatory towards people. I'm not saying that US is an ideal place to live, but
Yeah.
one thing is for sure that US is some place which is providing you equal opportunity to excel. Obviously, you face hurdles whenever you are progressing, whenever you are moving around, but their culture of providing opportunities, that idea of great American dream, it attracts youth from everywhere in the world. If you look into the economic, intellectual, or academic resources of the US in contemporary times, take an example of any of the academic field in the world. For example, engineering, for example, medicine, for example, business studies, for example, social sciences. You will observe that more than 80% of the world academia is based in the US, whether we like it or not, but this is the reality. So, on one side, there is a bulge of more than 80% of intelligentsia living in one place, and on the other side, there is rest of the world. So, what can you expect them to act
Yeah.
or to live in?
Yes.
So, whether you like it or not, whether you like those loud mouths of American politicians or American leadership, they have created that situation in which they can speak in that manner, the way they were trying to rather treat or bully that Ukrainian president recently. That was rather a very unprecedented event happened in the history. Nobody's seen that on the media, but Donald Trump is capable of doing and saying anything.
Yeah.
So
I
this
guess we just
is
have to
Donald Trump.
accept it. Yeah. Yeah.
हाँ वो मतलब that is a reality. I agree to that. Although I have a disagreement with that, but I accept it. Yes, this can
Yeah.
happen.
Thank you for your interesting thoughts about that. My next
Uh-huh.
question regarding history would be, we all know that Americans' rise to power was most seen and identified after World War II. In your opinion, what were the
Mhm.
reasons behind it, and how did that shape the United States into its current economic dominance?
Okay. So again, Zainab, we'll have to look into the legacy of the global conflicts. So World War One and World War Two, the results were pretty much in favor of the Allied powers previously
Yeah.
led by the Britain. But World War Two led to the collapse of the major colonial structure of Europe, and there was a power vacuum. Global politics are shaped all the time in the known human history where there is always a stronger economic entity or military entity or a powerful nation. Through the ages, we observe that there are different reasons because of which, or there are different elements because of which countries became powerful. In the distant past, it was primarily the military power. But in the 20th century, that was a combination of three elements, which is hard power, soft power, and smart power now.
Yes.
And Americans in all these three sides were actually powerful enough and stronger enough in comparison with anybody. Primarily, the question which you asked, that what happened after World War II, was that there was a major power vacuum. Britain was trying to pick bits and pieces in post-World War situation. Their main land was destructed, destroyed. They wanted to reconstruct that. That is why the process of decolonization started. Countries like Pakistan, India, and other colonial
Yeah.
countries got
Yeah.
independence. It was not mainly, you can say, the political struggle of the people, but it was it include the situational factors which actually compelled those colonial powers to get rid of these colonies.
Yeah.
That include the economic reasons, that also include the political mobilization as well, and this allowed Americans to become powerful. Again, I will refer back to the natural geography of the US. At some time in global relations, you will find that this was a problem, but in case of World War One and World War Two, this came as an advantage to the US. In both wars, mainland America was hardly attacked once or twice in the whole conflict. So, American economy transformed gradually from an economic entity into a war economy. They developed military hardware industry to an extent that they became major suppliers of the world weapons across
Yeah.
you can say world wars.
Yeah.
Keeping this thing in mind, that isolated geography and at the same time the collapse of the major European powers such as Britain, France, Germany, and other smaller, Russia for that matter, or Soviets for that matter, were not as competitive as Americans were in terms of wealth and in terms of, you can say, economic influence which they were allowing. So,
Yeah.
mainly, in my personal opinion, and this is a historical fact as well, that basically Americans actually filled that power gap or power vacuum which gradually start to evolve after World War One and eventually into a post-World War situation, which resulted further in the Cold War.
Yeah. So now moving from history, let's come towards global diplomacy and current affairs. Now,
Mhm.
this question sort of relates to what you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
Do you think that the soft power element, soft power as in your culture and diplomacy, has a greater influence by the US as a global hegemon, or was military power, as in hard power, the leading player?
Okay, I will actually divide this question into different eras in the post
Yeah,
World War II. First, I'll shed light on the Cold War period. Cold War period from 1947-48, particularly up till the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, that was the time, Zainab, when US was using both its military power
yeah,
as well as its economic influence on different countries.
yeah,
This was the time when they start to use media and electronic means to defame Soviet communist ideology across the globe. If you look into the Hollywood movies, characters like James
yeah,
Bond, characters like Rocky, characters like different type of movies, if you look into the entire Hollywood, they actually portrayed themselves as a savior of the world, and they portrayed themselves as the saviors of civilization, and
yeah,
portrayed Soviets and the communist ideology, including Chinese and North Americans, as
yeah,
the enemy of the mankind and enemy of the human race.
yeah,
So this actual conflict was actually built in a way where they actually try to portray that they are standing on the right side of history, and ideologies which are challenging them in Cold War, that was
yeah,
communist ideology, they are on the wrong side of history.
yeah,
We sitting in the 21st century in year 2025 can easily say that yes, they were triumphant, they defeated the communist ideology,
mm,
but we cannot say that they are absolutely right. They used all fair and unfair means to actually elaborate their image and presented themselves as saviors of the mankind. So, for that purpose, wherever they needed any military power, they indulged or rather sponsored that. In the Cold War, we have examples of various alliances starting from NATO, CETO, CENTO, for that purpose, financing
yeah,
different countries, awarding them the status of the US ally against communism. So they tried to fund and sponsor wars during the Cold War. And one important thing, Zainab, you must keep in mind that they avoid direct confrontation,
yeah,
because the lesson of the
yes,
history was that whenever they got involved directly in the conflict, they faced reaction and rebuttal. We have
yes,
examples of Vietnam, we have examples of Central America, in Nicaragua as well, where
yeah,
Americans faced severe resistance. Even
yeah,
in 1950s, in the Cuban conflict, there was a incident called Bay of Pig, where Americans were miserably defeated by the local Cubans, or Cuban existence is just like a small dot in front of US. So, keeping this thing in mind, Americans gradually opted the policy to fund the conflict rather to be direct part of it. We
yeah,
have examples of Afghan war, the Soviet
yeah,
attack when Soviets directly allowed their forces to enter into Afghanistan. What they did, they took Pakistanis as a proxies, and Pakistan started to fight that proxy war on behalf of the Americans. Americans spent
yeah,
money. And later we observed that they were trying to do the same thing elsewhere during the Cold War. And
yeah,
they tried to opt the policy that they will actually use both military power as well as their economic and social influence. Now, coming to the economic influence, keep in mind after the creation of the UN, Americans became, or US became the biggest sponsors of IMF and World Bank. In case of any development project or in case of any lending or borrowing, it is basically the American influence which determine that where they will invest money and whom they will where they will invest and what type of projects they will actually fund
yeah,
in any country. For that purpose, you have example of Pakistan, Egypt, or African nations, or the countries,
yeah,
the economies who are always in need of financial support. So they use their economic influence through these economic entities of the world, those economic institutions, which is later known as neocolonialism.
yeah,
NEO, neocolonialism, and this is the economic influence or economic colonization through these economic entities like World Bank, like IMF, and that's how the countries tend to influence. Keep in mind, post-Cold War era is a kind of era where countries now start to avoid direct occupation of different places.
Yeah.
They were influencing their puppet governments through economic policies, through diplomatic means, through diplomatic channels, and that's how they actually control the public opinion in respective countries in their own favor or against them. So my answer would be that they were using both military as well as economic influence to actually comprehend and establish their authority and their influence over lesser nations of the world. Okay?
So
Yes.
yeah, adding up to your question, so would you say that United Nations, United States is more of a realist, has a more realist approach or a more liberal approach? Because they advocate for democracy, yet their approaches are realist, as in they put their self-interest above the interest of others. So what would you answer to that?
Americans are absolutely realist. You cannot expect Americans to be upright all the time.
Mm,
Whenever they need, they will mold their policies in the name of American people and American interest,
yeah,
regardless of the fact that whether they need to support any democracy, regardless of the fact that they became supporters to the dictators like Ayub or General
yeah,
Musharraf or General Zia. So they are not bothered that whosoever is in power. It depends upon that who is more convenient in dealing with and who will actually answer their interests more comfortably in comparison with any other
yeah,
person.
yeah.
So American politics or Uncle Sam's politics are based on realism. Absolutely. आपने मतलब you must have been watched the Uncle Sam's caricature. So that Uncle Sam represents that evil character who can actually try to achieve his objectives by hook or by crook. So for them, morality, ethics, legalities are only relevant to their interest. If it suits them, they'll follow that. If it doesn't suit them, they'll invite the military chief and encourage them to
Yeah,
cooperate with them in wherever these interests
yeah.
actually supports them or in their own favor. So Zainab never ever thought that Americans follow morality or Americans follow or American diplomacy follow any ethical basis.
Yeah.
They are absolute realists and they can switch as per their needs. So this is for sure. You must not build any kind of moral upright for Americans to achieve in diplomacy or politics at global level. So this is what I think and I believe and I studied rather and I can prove that with
Yeah,
all the historical developments in post-Cold
yeah,
War era, at least for that purpose.
yeah.
Since the time they
I
became an
yeah,
active participant of the world politics.
yeah. I wouldn't argue with that because current events support your judgment. Now this sort of links to our
Mhm.
second question that says, the United States has a rather on and off relationship with isolationism. We see that George
Mhm.
Washington, in his farewell speech, advised the US leaders to be neutral and not get into alliances. But then for some
Mhm.
time, the US was involved in global politics, primarily after the
Mhm.
World Wars. Still, now again, Donald Trump as a leader has brought America First policy. My question is, why is it so appealing in some periods and wholly ignored in others?
Mhm. The answer to this question lies in my previous answer as well.
Yeah.
Americans are not rigid in their policies. But when you refer to persons like George Washington or the 18th or 19th century American presidents and American policy, that was an era of American isolationism. It was
Yes.
a kind of time when Americans fully following the idea of keeping themselves aloof from the continental politics.
Yeah.
Because if you look into the post French Revolution era of Europe, the 19th century was highly unstable century. It was a period when continuous revolutions and toppling of the governments were happening in the Europe, and Americans were pretty much aware of the fact that if they'll allow those Europeans to interact with them, or Americans start to interfere in those policies, invariably it will impact American domestic politics and American policy and economy as well. So they were not in a position to afford any kind of, you can say, alliance with any particular idea. Europe of 19th century was witnessing a transition from absolute monarchy to representative form of government. That transition was gradually going on in continental countries. By continental, I mean the countries within the territorial continent, not Britain. Britain became a transitional democracy since long, but after French Revolution, those representative form of governments and ideas were spreading across European continent. The emergence of different kind of ideologies was spreading, and this
Yeah.
was overall creating a domino impact on the
Yeah.
administration and the governments. So American policy continued with a very famous doctrine known as Monroe Doctrine. That happened or that was embraced in early 19th century up till World War One. And if you look into the historical facts, Americans were not the original participant of World War One. Americans joined the war in 1917. That is almost after 3 to 4 years start of the war. So one can say that the final punching blow was provided by Americans in the later half because the European powers were too exhausted that war was never reaching
Yes.
to an end. So
Yes.
keeping this thing in mind that 19th century provided a transition of Americans from isolationism and eventually in the beginning of 20th century situations became so intense that it became virtually impossible for US to keep themselves isolated from the politics of Europe.
Yeah.
So the first half answer is that it was basically a legacy which started from the time when America emerged on the world map, and later for almost a century, century and a half or quarter century, Americans kept that isolation. But with World War
Yeah.
One, they were actually forced into that because their own economic political interests were involved. Now
Yeah.
coming to Donald Trump is not making that hard line that we will keep ourselves isolated from the world politics. I am predicting now for the next 3 4 years, you will always see Donald Trump by poking him. He'll poke each and every major country, whether they were the traditional rivals or whether they are the traditional friends of the US. Recently, if you observe the body language and the, you can say, post discussion memorandums issued in the meeting so far in the Donald Trump, I can only give you an example of Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi's apparent that visit not able to achieve the desired results, whatever they were thinking.
Yeah.
But still, Donald Trump and his close associates like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they tend to introduce policies where they were trying to look for India as an alternative market from China. So this is something which is pretty much an economic thing, and these Americans are very flexible in their ideas. About 2 days ago, I was looking into a statement of Donald Trump, and he says that I will very soon visit Saudi Arabia and sign trade agreements over
Yes.
$1 trillion. So this
Yeah.
indicates that they are very flexible. Wherever they'll get profit, they'll actually set aside their argument of isolationism and they'll continue their policy. So one another thing which I want to add here, Zainab, that it is not possible for American president to make decision in isolation. American Congress,
Yes.
American military bureaucracy, for
Yes.
example, Pentagon, American political culture of political parties, particularly Republicans and Democrats, they are very influential in deciding that what American government will do.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is an exception. I must tell you, I am following American politics since 1995 as a student. And since then, I observe that irrespective of the fact that whosoever is in power, they are not that much expressive in public. But Donald Trump is. Donald Trump can say and make a comment of anything because he remained part of the media and he's someone who actually manipulate public opinion. And one thing I can safely say about Donald Trump that he can lie very conveniently even in public. A situation could be completely different and he may act as an irresponsible person. So it is not that easy that if Donald Trump is saying something, it means that it has been said and it will eventually become an American policy. So keeping this thing in mind, we'll have to observe that whether Americans will remain isolated because the kind of engagements which they are having globally right now, I don't think it would be possible for them to keep themselves aloof in near future. They are too
Perfect.
much involved everywhere in the world.
They are. Um, so how might the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict impact the future US military strategy and its commitment to NATO members? And do you think that this whole meeting at the Oval Office was it a setup by Trump to humiliate Zelensky, or was it
Yeah.
something that happened actually?
Uh, I would actually look into this entire situation, and I will give my analysis on that. And this is what I'll be observing. In my opinion, Americans were probably not estimating that this conflict will last that much. So one can say that they underestimated Vladimir Putin's involvement in the Ukraine. The length of the conflict is probably too much and it is costing Americans too much. This is one my observation. Number two, uh, because American support came under Joe Biden and Americans provided, you can say, support without raising any kind of questions. Military, economic, diplomatic support was provided in an unparalleled manner. On the other side, Vladimir Putin took it personally and they decided that they'll continue and they'll actually transform that entire country into a Stone Age era
Yeah,
place. So, keeping
yeah,
this thing in mind, it became more of a personal thing. Now, Donald Trump in the entire presidential campaign argued that I will end that Ukraine war. And he was not realizing the fact that how much human cost Ukraine spent, what
yeah,
infrastructure damage they faced, and
yeah,
suddenly asking for a ceasefire without taking the people into confidence
yeah,
was something which may not happen.
yeah.
Yes, you are a global bully. Yes, you are most powerful economic nation of the world. Yes, you are funding that war. It doesn't mean that you may start to humiliate the leadership in public.
Yes,
Americans are known to do these kind of things in private.
yes, yes,
They are very much like that. There was no second question from my side that this is something which may not happen with the leadership. My only concern is that it should not happen in front of the media. I know that Americans can do anything, and they know the actual situation that Ukraine was too much, you can say, depending upon the American diplomacy, American military support, American financial support. But at the same time, this war was costing US a lot. I would
yes,
rather give you an example of American exit from Afghanistan in year 2021.
yes,
That was an abrupt and sudden exit without making a homework that what may actually happen. And we know that resulting resulting that abrupt exit, Taliban came in power within a span of 1 month. So
yes,
that Afghan government, Afghan American sponsored government was not even capable or to withstand for even a month. So this
yes,
indicate poor American policy making. Americans
yeah,
not realize that what may happen. So
yeah,
in this case, in Ukraine's case, my observation is that Americans just want to get rid of this burden. And while doing so, they are not realizing that how to make a homework which is good enough. अब जैसे आपने you people have been observing that the day he took the oath, the kind of executive orders he signed, this indicate that he is in a hurry.
yes,
So, no wonder that this hurry may lead to further aggravating the conflicts in years to come. This is what I
yes,
observe, and this is what I think that the kind of hurry he is showing, this may result in aggravating the conflicts in different regions of the world. The
yes,
flashpoints which are always there, for example, Syria, for example, Middle East, Israel for that purpose, even Pakistan, India for that purpose, they are not doing any bit right now to ease the situation. They are just trying to mold situation in their own favor, and
yeah.
this may result in more disaster, in my opinion. Okay,
Um,
yes, next.
yeah. So now you mentioned a lot of how the US has played a role in global politics, right? And recently in politics, I'd like to add that they were studying United Nations, and that's why I keep saying United Nations instead of United States. Um,
Sorry,
yeah,
no issue. I
um,
understand by the
yeah,
question that you are only referring to the US, not to the UN.
yeah. Um, but so. Why isn't the US held accountable for all these actions? And is the United Nations seen as a Western imperialist tool? Because I get it, they have the UN Security Council veto power, but still they've never been held accountable for it. Why is that so?
Because US is US. US right now is the sole superpower of the world, the strongest economic and military entity of the world right now. So they are in reality the bully of the world. So
Yeah.
who can ask questions? I'll take you back to 2004. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact or not. When Americans decided to launch an attack on Iraq,
Yeah.
I remember that
Yes.
American Secretary of State, I think at that time was Powell, who was the Foreign Secretary to be very exact. He wanted to present the UN resolution to attack Iraq in UN Security Council,
Yeah.
but they realized the fact that some of the veto powers are
Yes.
planning to veto that resolution. So Americans decided that they will not present that resolution in the UN, and they decided to withdraw. They took another route and they decided to launch an attack on Iraq from NATO's platform. So, wherever and whenever Americans think that UN will create any kind of resistance against their intent, they will take another route for that purpose. And I remember that American Secretary of State earlier presented evidences in the UN Security Council that we actually located empty chemical weapon shells, their
Yes.
transportation, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. And they just wanted to have that UN cover that we want to
Yeah.
topple Saddam Hussein's
Yes.
government. So in every case, you will observe that Americans able to justify their attack from the platform of UN, and if they think that UN will not behave according to or not act according to their wish, they will take an alternative route. During the Cold War, we know that military platforms like NATO, military platforms like CETO, CENTO, bilateral
Yes.
relations between countries, that provided them space to launch any military offensive against their interests across the globe. For example, they attacked Afghanistan totally, completely, solely at their own. They didn't take
Yes.
NATO into confidence at that time. Then they
Yes.
launched attack on Iraq in 2004 without taking any consent from the UN members. Apparently, we can simply say that in 2004, there was a clear opposition of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the
Yes.
Chinese government that they will veto American resolution in the Security
Yes.
Council. And in case of veto, that means that publicly a world opinion can be created that Americans are becoming hostile towards a nation.
Yes.
So rather to face that hostility or that you can say resistance, they decide that they'll do it from their own and they will launch from a different kind of platform. So
Yes.
in terms of UN, if you look into the economic terms, US is the biggest donor of the UN as well. And on the other side, UN head offices are in New York. That is something which also play a very vital and important role. So far, all the UN administration, the office workers are mostly coming with the consent of the American government and the American system. आप देख लो कि either these people are studied from the American universities or they were the ex-diplomats. Somehow they are connected directly or indirectly with the US. So
Agree.
American influence in the Cold War and in the post-Cold War era cannot be ignored from the UN as an independent entity. You
Yeah.
will observe that General Secretary Antonio Guterres or anyone who is making statements against the American policy, it will not make any difference until Americans themselves think that they want to do anything.
Yeah.
Just look at that American withdrawal from the environmental agreements and Kyoto
Yes.
protocols and different kind of
Yes.
agreements recently. So this is morally, ethically the lowest ebb of diplomacy that
Yeah.
Americans, being the largest emitters of carbon dioxide, decide to withdraw from those agreements. So this
Yeah.
indicate that American own administrative policies actually drive their policies, and they try their level best or they try whatever they want to or whatever is possible to influence the UN decision making as well.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much, sir. I guess there are only 6 minutes left in the meeting, so we'll start a new one and I'll meet you then.
Okay, okay.
Um, So, sir, adding up to what you were talking about, US's role in the UN, um, we're coming to the end of the podcast, and I'll ask a couple of two, three more questions, and one of them includes, um, should the UN Security Council be reformed? Should the members be reformed? Because I was watching this video, and the UK president did talk about, Keir Starmer did say that the veto power should be given to other nation states. So should it be reformed or not?
UN reforms are now the need of the time, in my personal opinion. Either UN should be closed down or the UN Security Council should be reformed enough. Because the kind of structures which were made in 1945 were basically they were made keeping in mind the failure of, you can say, League of Nations. So, League of Nations was mainly confined to the continental politics. And
Yes.
unfortunately, UN unable to came out of the influence of this things of interwar period. And we observed that these five nations, particularly US, Soviets, later Russia, China, they manipulated the security, you can say, purview of the UN a lot. Keeping this thing in mind, there is an ample need of UN reforms. This, in my opinion, my personal judgment started at the turn of the century, at the turn of the millennium, when the Sustainable Development Goals and Millennium Development Goals and MUNs were arranged, and there were more awareness which was created at grassroots level about the role of the UN. But unfortunately, the reforms where they were actually needed, particularly in the UN Security Council, they
Yeah.
were not introduced. Now the question remains, and a pertinent question is that whom should be given the veto power? In my personal opinion, that the purview of the veto power should be changed in the recent times. Now, what is the criteria of being a veto power is something which cannot exist in the modern day time.
Yeah.
India always remain a candidate of veto power.
Yeah.
Pakistan being the next nuclear power was claiming for that. Pakistan also claimed that being one Muslim representative required in the UN Security Council. So whenever there is an argument, the argument can be built on anything. So, in practical terms, what I think, in my personal opinion, it is very, very difficult right now to reform UN in existing circumstances. But obviously, as a citizen, as a person of the third world and the second world, I always desire that UN Security Council at least should be reformed enough.
So do you think India should be given the power? Because there was this news channel where it advocated India had it was a very, very biased news channel. And I was fearing that the woman was about to bang her desk because she constantly, India donated these many troops and we are the largest contributor, blah,
Uh,
blah, blah. So should it be or not?
Can I ask you people a question that what arguments do you have India not getting any right of being the veto member of the UN? On what basis do you think that India doesn't deserve to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
I think it does deserve to be one.
You,
Because
Shayan, what do you think?
If you ask the political leaders of Pakistan, they might refute that India is
yes,
too anti-Pakistan to be given and veto power. But rest, if you look on a more unbiased factor, then India surely deserves to be in, veto power in the Security Council. Just
When you
what?
act as a neutral observer,
Yeah.
India ticks so many boxes to be the UN Permanent Security Council member, being the largest political democracy, being one of the largest economy in terms of volume,
yeah,
being strategically located country, being a nuclear power, these
yes.
things go in favor of India. But India becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council will create imbalance in the region. China is there, Pakistan is there as a nuclear power, and Indian governmental policies and internal politics are very much questionable in these circumstances. Obviously, being a Pakistani, I will not allow because I am very sure of the fact that India will surely use its status against Pakistan. And if India deserved to be the member, then why not Pakistan? Pakistan is a nuclear power. Pakistan is the fifth most populated country of the world. Geography, diversity, that is there. So if you talk about earlier five nations, they are not the ideal countries of the world. Whether you talk about US, Russia, Britain, France, or China for that matter, there are problems in those countries as well. So they were given that permanent member status in the post World War II situation, and this continued because it is very, very difficult to reform UN. But India, no doubt, is a very, very strong economic, political, strategic entity. If we not recognize them as a military power, but India is a very, very important entity. And this 21st century is an age of soft and smart power, not that much military or hard power for that purpose. This is what I unfold the situation, and I think that these things happen in that manner. इसीलिए आप गौर करोगे, you will observe that Pakistan gradually is losing its importance and existence in terms of bilateral conflicts in global, you can say, situation. China remained pretty much silent actor. The Middle East, which is supposedly the biggest support of Pakistan's economy, always keep set aside bilateral conflicts of Pakistan and India when it comes to the mutual relations of the Middle East and the Indian relationship. So this thing pretty much highlight that Indian importance in terms of manpower, in terms of supplier of the workforce, in terms of the largest market entity, these things attract world like anything. एक आपको मैं सिंपल एग्जांपल देता हूँ. If you are actually Shayan holding a ballpoint in your hand, in terms of economy, for example, in Pakistan, if there are 10 buyers of this ballpoint, India have more than 55 buyers of this ballpoint, simply in terms of population number. So market size is 5 times bigger than Pakistan. So this thing distinct India from Pakistan when it comes to bilateral, you can say, comparison. But when you take it globally, you will observe that the largest migrant population of any origin in the world is of Indian origin.
Yeah.
They are even more than the Chinese across the globe
Yes.
who have migrated from the world. तो
Yes.
उन्होंने क्या किया है कि somehow those Indian migrants have that tendency to behave more patriotic than any other migrant community of the world. So this NRI culture is actually part of the Indian lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. So to conclude this wonderful podcast, honestly, so basically, to cover up what we're talking about, we talked about the US history, how it's currently acting up. And some of the points that I understood was that currently there's a bit of instability going on. Trump posts on X that, oh, there's gonna be no peace agreement, and then now there's a peace agreement in Saudi Arabia. Then there were tariffs on Mexican and other goods, and now he's like, no, I'm gonna delay it to April. Now there's one question that's occurring in my mind, and that's, do you think with these changing dynamics of US policy and overall global politics, will America's status as the global hegemon remain as steady as before, or will it be weakened or potentially be taken away?
Okay, Zainab, I will add one comment to your question that Donald
Yes.
Trump is an exception. He is not a conventional politician who tend to hold his mouth while making a comment in public. So, as a global observer, it became very difficult for a student like me or student like you or any other observer of international relations or journalism or politics to differentiate that this is American policy and this is merely a Donald Trump's statement. So these
Yeah.
1.5 month in presidency even indicated that whatever he said about 2 or 1 month ago is now been reverted, and he took a U-turn on that argument. So for Donald Trump, we'll have to make a very careful statement that whether it's an American policy or whether it's a statement by Donald Trump, one thing. Secondly, in terms of American influence in near future, apparently it seems that Americans are doing their level best to actually increase and maintain their hegemony across the globe. The law of
Yes.
nature definitely will influence, and invariably there will be a different composition. I am not sure that till how long it will last, because the thing is that major economic entities of the world are still based in the US. Technology hub is the US, intelligentsia hub is the US, world economic activities revolve around American policies, new economic elements. I would not say that whether it's legal or not, but for example, look into the cryptos, bitcoins, and stuff like that. The hub of that economic parallel economy is US. So these are different ways and means through which they are trying to maintain their hegemony and control over others. And in near future, I am not seeing any alternative to that. Chinese, no doubt, in last 30, 40 years emerged as an alternative manufacturing unit of the world. But at the turn of the century and in the beginning of, or rather recently in last 10, 15 years, Chinese have spent on research and development in technology and in industrial manufacturing. They are providing an alternative, but I don't know how long it will take for these Chinese to surpass American control. Volume maybe could be a different question, but I don't see Chinese to become a alternative to US in near future. In near future, predictions for the next 50 years or next 100 years could be something unreal, because so many technological changes are happening in recent times that you cannot predict that what may happen. Just observe that what happened
Yeah.
in last 2 years with AI's inventions. AI tools have transformed all different modes of communication, learning, education, technology, etc., etc. A layman like me in technology became a technological expert by using these already made and prepared AI tools. So, मुझे तो नहीं पता, I am not sure that whether these formal education institutions will even survive in next 4 to 5 years from now or not. And what would be the shape of the modern education when you people will be coming into practical life 5 or 7 years from now, honestly speaking.
लेकिन sir, other than education, a Belt and Road Initiative बारे में क्या कहेंगे? Isn't
Ah,
that a way
that
of
is
yeah?
that represent and reflect the dynamic vision of the Chinese leadership. China, no doubt, actually have that capable leadership who are thinking beyond the centuries. Belt and Road Initiative was remarkable. That is why the current president of the China, Xi Jinping, is actually marked as the greatest of all after Mao. He is someone who actually transformed Chinese existence, and he is making
Yes.
China as a mortal country in years to come, because nobody even estimated that Chinese may initiate that alternative economic route, and that is a direct challenge to American hegemony in years to come. So they are totally avoiding the entire route of South China, Indian Ocean, and other places, and they are just trying to reach the populated belly of the world. Even they are interested
Yep.
in extending their economic relations with India. Pakistan is an integral part through CPAC, and connecting the entire Central Asia and the Middle East with each other. They are now offering remarkable type of economic deals to the countries who are specializing in different kind of minerals. For example, they are signing the deals to buy coals for the next 50 years. They are
Yes.
signing the deals to buy iron ore for the next 50 years from different countries. And this indicate that their plans and their strategies are far ahead of time. This is something which is exceptional, but how long it will sustain and what type of results it will create, because estimates can easily be changed with any natural calamity. Anything happened globally may change the plans of everyone. Nobody estimated that COVID will come in 2020 and it changed the entire economy and
Yes.
economic composition of the world. So anything happened naturally, or you cannot challenge you can say, the destiny, or you cannot challenge the mother nature, और ऐसा कुछ हो जाता है, तो I'm not sure that where China
Yeah.
will stand in near future.
Thank you so much for your invaluable insights and for your invaluable time. The journey of the United States as a global power is complex and ever evolving. As always, we'll continue closely by watching how these dynamics shape our world at Roshni. Thank you for tuning in Behind the Mic by Roshni. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into issues that matter. Until next time, this is your host, Zainab Alam, signing off. Take care.